Hello and welcome to Radio Faces, brought to you by HCCTV. I'm Indy Kalu of Sports Radio 610, and he is John the General McClain, Hall of Fame sports writer for the Chronicle. You could also catch him on Sports Radio 610, but when you're in front of your computer, don't forget to go to chron.com and you can see all his great articles.
We've got our first show of the new year. We think it's a great show here at our HCC Main Street studios. Coming up later, the original radio face, Houston radio legend Barry Warner from Sports Radio 610. But right now, Indy Kalu played 12 years in the NFL, defensive end. I want to know, Indy, what do you think about Gary Kubiak coming back with the Texans?
Well, people like you let me know that it was going to happen before it was actually made official, so I wasn't too surprised when it happened, when they made it official the other day. I was a little concerned with Frank Bush being the scapegoat. Of course, he had a horrible season on the defensive side of the ball. I didn't expect him to keep his job, but one guy expected to stick around was Johnny Holland, and that's the linebacker coach, the A&M grad. He's a guy, not only is he a player's coach, he's a good coach. He makes players better. When you look at a Zach Dowse, who was a 7th-round draft pick, undersized, underweight, under everything, but he turned him into a starter, a very productive starter. And you look at a D'Amico Ryans, who can't say anything wrong with Johnny Holland. I think he's the one guy who should have kept his job on the defensive side of the ball, and I didn't like to see him leave.
I talked to some of the linebackers, and they were upset about Johnny. Johnny not only did they say was a great coach, he was an even better person. And those guys are hard to find. He'll bounce back. You know, he had a chance to go to A&M with Mike Sherman to be defensive coordinator, and he turned him down to stay with the Texans. And I think the reason that move was made is because the next defensive coordinator, whoever it is, like Wade Phillips, will have his own linebacker coach that he wants to bring in as part of that staff. And one thing that I'm not surprised about, I thought David Gibbs, the secondary coach, did one of the worst coaching jobs I've ever seen. We'll find out next year. Were all the DBs terrible, or was it a terrible coaching job?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's a little bit of both. I'll never call a player that made it to the NFL terrible, but I don't think they were in the right position. I think the coach was way in over his head, and they did the coach a disservice by not bringing in that veteran leadership, maybe a guy who's towards the end of his career who could show these guys how to play certain techniques, what they're supposed to be thinking on when they're on the field. You know, it's one thing to go through meetings, go on the whiteboard and see the X's and O's that a coach could explain, but it's another thing to have a Dante Robinson, even an Aaron Glenn who's been retired for 2 years, in the meeting room with them, on the field with them, showing them the technique.
I think what the Texans need to do is follow the models that went on in New Orleans and Green Bay. They had big-time offenses. Their defenses were terrible. They gave the keys to the defense to former head coaches, big-time coordinators, Dom Capers in Green Bay, Greg Williams in New Orleans, and now they're among the best in the league. Another model that Texans fans should hope that it works out like with Chicago last year. They told them, you know, you got to win next year. They spent money on Julius Peppers. They hired Mike Martz, a coordinator a lot of teams didn't want, and it worked out great. Now they've got a first-round bye. That's another thing. I think the Texans got to spend money for a free agent like Champ Bailey, who's leaving Denver. I think he would work out great with the Texans unless he insists on going to a Super Bowl contender at this point in his career.
Right, and not just one veteran free agent. You have to have multiple. You talked about Chicago. I really like what Chicago did in the offseason. They brought in multiple guys. Julius Peppers, of course, was the biggest name. Then the year before, they brought in Jay Cutler. They weren't afraid to make certain moves, and that's why they're playing in the playoffs this year.
They've got to use that top pick for an impact defensive player. They've got to sign a couple of guys. They always talk about the culture of losing. How do you change players who have a fragile confidence the first time something goes bad, boom, they go straight down the tubes? How do you change that?
Well, you bring in guys who know what it means to win, who knows what it means to come back from losses, and you have to bring some playoff experience. I mean, when it's all said and done while you're playing, it's not like you're going back in your memory bank about what you did to get to the playoffs, but it's woven in your DNA. So that's why there's a culture. When they say there's a culture of winning, there's a culture of losing. And you saw it with the Texans this year when they would be up by a certain number of points. You always had this sense that they were going to find a way to lose. And even when they were mounting these great comebacks, it was like, you know what, they're probably going to come back. But before those 4 zeros hit the scoreboard, they're going to find a way to mess it up. And that's what happened. And all those guys are going to remember how this season was next year. So they're definitely going to have to bring in some guys who didn't go through this horrific season.